There is a language buried inside your surname. Most people never hear it. Somewhere in a Welsh valley, centuries before written records, a name was given to a man, not as decoration, but as identity. A son of someone. A dweller of somewhere. A keeper of some trade or trait. And that name did not simply describe him. It followed his blood. Today, that name might sit quietly on a passport, an email signature, a gravestone. Unremarkable. Ordinary. Except it isn't. Because a rare Welsh surname is not just a word. It may be one of the last surviving threads connecting a living person to a genetic population that has occupied the same corner of Britain for thousands of years, largely undisturbed by the invasions that reshaped everyone else. For most of the British Isles, the last 2,000 years were a story of arrival. Romans, Angles, Saxons, Vikings, Normans. Each wave left a genetic signature layered over the last, like sediment. But something strange happens when geneticists turn their instruments toward Wales. In certain valleys, certain family lines, the sediment barely moved. The DNA looks less like a layered cake and more like a stone that time simply passed over. And some of the names attached to that stone are dying out. This is the story of what those rare surnames are quietly preserving, and what modern genome science is only now beginning to read. If you carry one of these names, or know someone who does, what follows may change how you see it. For a long time, the accepted story was simple enough to fit on a museum plaque. Wales, the narrative went, was a Celtic refuge, the place ancient Britons retreated to when Anglo-Saxon settlers pushed westward across the lowlands in the centuries after Rome withdrew. Surnames were assumed to follow a fairly uniform pattern, patronymic naming, built from a father's first name, common across Wales until the English administrative system pressured families into fixed hereditary surnames sometime around the 16th to 18th centuries. Under that model, a name like Cadwallader, Gethin, Meredith, or Bevan was simply a linguistic artifact, a snapshot of medieval Welsh, frozen at the moment English bureaucracy demanded consistency. Interesting for genealogists. Not particularly revealing about deep ancestry. Historians were comfortable with this. Linguists were comfortable with this. For decades, that was where the story ended. But somewhere along the way, a detail refused to sit still. Surname distribution in Wales did not behave the way population geneticists expected. In theory, if surnames were simply linguistic labels adopted in the early modern period, their geographic spread should be relatively loose. Families move, marry outward, disperse over centuries. Instead, researchers mapping rare Welsh surnames against genetic sampling found something tighter than expected. Certain names clustered with unusual precision around specific river valleys and upland parishes, the same tight radius, generation after generation, as though something other than administrative habit was holding them in place. That was the first crack. It raised a quiet, almost uncomfortable question. What if some of these surnames were not simply naming a family? What if they were, without anyone intending it, tracing a genetic population that had barely mixed with its neighbors at all? This is where genetics stopped being a supporting detail and became the investigation itself. Two tools mattered most. The Y chromosome, passed from father to son with only rare mutation, travels almost in lockstep with a patronymic surname. A man named Llewellyn today, whose father was named Llewellyn, is likely carrying a Y chromosome lineage that has moved through that same name for many generations. That overlap is what makes surname-linked DNA studies possible at all. Separately, whole genome and autosomal analysis, the mix of DNA inherited from every ancestral line, not just the paternal one, lets researchers see the broader ancestral makeup of a population. How much of it resembles earlier Iron Age Britons? How much reflects later migrations? How isolated or connected a group has been over time? When these tools were pointed at rural Welsh populations carrying rare, geographically stable surnames, the results were not simply confirmatory. They were unsettling in a productive way. Some of these lineages showed remarkably low levels of the genetic signal associated with Anglo-Saxon and later English ancestry, lower, in some sampled populations, than researchers initially expected even for Wales, which was already understood to be one of the more genetically distinct regions of Britain. In other words, the isolation implied by the tight surname clustering was not an illusion. Something really had stayed put. If you're the kind of person who finds it strange that a name can outlast an empire, this is exactly the kind of story worth following. Subscribe because there is a great deal more hidden in ordinary surnames than most of us ever suspect. But the story did not simply confirm purity. That would have been the easy, expected outcome, and expected outcomes rarely survive contact with a real genome. Instead, the data complicated things. Within these same isolated, rare surname populations, researchers found genetic signals that did not map cleanly onto the standard Celtic refuge story either. Alongside the expected deep British ancestry, some lineages carried faint but detectable signatures that pointed toward earlier, harder-to-place ancestral streams, signals some researchers associate with the very earliest farming populations to reach Britain thousands of years before the Iron Age, and, in certain samples, subtle traces that some interpretations link to Bronze Age steppe-associated migrations that reshaped much of prehistoric Europe. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. The story did not collapse. It widened. What had looked like a single, simple narrative, ancient Britain's retreat to Wales, stay put, keep their names, was beginning to look like a much older, layered accumulation. Not one wave of ancestry preserved in amber, but several waves, arriving across thousands of years, gradually folding into a population that then, much later, simply stopped absorbing new arrivals as quickly as the rest of Britain did. At this point, researchers found themselves holding several possible explanations, and, this being genuinely unresolved territory, no single one has been definitively proven over the others. One possibility is straightforward geographic isolation. The mountainous terrain of much of Wales made large-scale migration and intermarriage with incoming populations simply less common, preserving older genetic strata almost by accident of topography rather than any deliberate cultural boundary. A second possibility involves a founder effect, a scenario where a relatively small ancestral population, isolated in a particular valley or region, expanded over centuries, meaning that many carriers of a rare surname today may trace back to a surprisingly narrow ancestral bottleneck amplifying certain rare genetic markers that would otherwise be diluted in a larger, more mixed population. A third possibility is cultural rather than purely geographic, the strength and persistence of the Welsh language itself. Linguists have long noted that Welsh survived as a living, spoken language far more robustly than other Celtic languages of Britain. Some researchers suggest that where language boundaries remained strong, intermarriage across those boundaries may have remained comparatively rarer, meaning the surname and the genome may have been held in place, in part, by something as intangible as which language a household spoke at the hearth. None of these explanations cancel each other out. The evidence suggests, cautiously, that all three may have worked together, terrain, founder populations, and language forming a kind of unintentional genetic seal that outlasted the Roman departure, the Anglo-Saxon settlements, the Norman conquest, and centuries of English administrative pressure. Then came the study that changed the resolution of the picture entirely. Large-scale genomic surveys of the British Isles, drawing on tens of thousands of samples rather than the small, localized datasets earlier researchers had worked with, allowed scientists to compare regional populations against each other with far greater statistical confidence than before. These broader panels, some incorporating ancient DNA extracted directly from prehistoric and early medieval burial sites, gave researchers something they had never really had, a way to compare living Welsh lineages not just against their English neighbors, but against actual ancient genomes recovered from the ground beneath their feet. The comparison was decisive in a way smaller studies could not be. Populations in parts of Wales, particularly those associated with older, rarer surnames concentrated in specific upland and western regions, showed genetic continuity with pre-Roman and early historic period samples that was measurably higher than in most other regions of England and lowland Britain. This was not folklore. This was not a romantic assumption about Celtic purity. This was a measurable statistical signal, published and scrutinized, showing that certain Welsh lineages genuinely do sit closer to Britain's deep ancestral populations than most other groups on the island. And then came the twist, the detail that even the researchers did not entirely expect going in. It was not simply that these populations were more ancient or less mixed, as the earlier framing might have suggested. What the deeper analysis revealed was more specific and stranger. Within several of the rare surname lineages studied, researchers identified genetic affinities that did not point toward one single ancestral source, but toward multiple distinct ancient populations layered on top of each other in a sequence: pre-farming hunter-gatherer ancestry, early Neolithic farmer ancestry, and Bronze Age steppe-associated ancestry, all detectable within the same small, geographically anchored population, in proportions that did not always match neighboring Welsh communities just a valley away. In other words, isolation had not frozen a single ancestral moment. It had frozen a mosaic, a compressed, unusually well-preserved record of multiple ancient migrations that, almost everywhere else in Britain, had been blurred and diluted by later mixing. What looked, on the surface, like a pure population turned out to be something far more interesting: a rare, intact archive of Britain's entire deep genetic history, held together, improbably, by a surname. Not the group researchers expected to be the most genetically complex. Not the population anyone assumed would hold the clearest window into prehistoric Britain. And yet here it was, hiding in plain sight, attached to names most people assumed were nothing more than old-fashioned. Why does this matter beyond Wales, beyond genealogy, beyond one small corner of Britain? Because it forces a correction to something almost everyone assumes without examining it: the idea that ancestry moves in straight lines, that a population either stayed the same or became mixed, that history sorts neatly into before and after. Real human history rarely behaves that way. Populations absorb, retreat, isolate, reconnect, and absorb again, over spans of time too long for any single story or surname to fully capture. What DNA reveals is not a simple answer. It is the outline of a process, messy, layered, and far older than any written record. Picture, for a moment, one of those valleys. Steep green slopes folding down toward a slate-gray river, sheep scattered along dry stone walls that have stood since before the surnames themselves existed. Mist settles in the low ground most mornings, the kind that does not lift until midday. A farmhouse sits where a farmhouse has likely sat, in some form, for well over 1,000 years. Somewhere in the local churchyard, half-eroded headstones repeat the same handful of family names, generation after generation, as they have since long before anyone thought to ask what those names might actually be carrying. It's easy to walk through a place like that and see nothing but quiet, rural stillness. It is much harder to see what modern genomics now suggests is actually there: a living, breathing continuity stretching back through the Bronze Age, through the first farmers, through hunter-gatherers who walked into a land bridge that would later become an island. Not stored in a museum. Stored in blood, and in a name spoken at the door of that farmhouse for 1,000 years. If a name like Cadwan, Ritterch, or Bledden seems strange to modern ears, that strangeness is not decoration. It may be one of the last audible fragments of a linguistic and genetic world that mostly vanished everywhere else on the island. These rare surnames are disappearing. Emigration, urbanization, smaller families, and the quiet pressure of a globalized world are doing what 1,000 years of invasion could not: thinning out lineages that survived Rome, survived the Anglo-Saxons, survived the Normans, and are now simply running out of children to carry them forward. Which means the genetic archive attached to them is disappearing too. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just quietly, the way most real history ends, not in a single dramatic collapse, but in a slow fading of continuity that no one fully notices until it's gone. Science did not simplify the story of these names. It made the story larger than anyone expected a surname to hold. What looked, at first glance, like an old-fashioned label, slightly awkward to pronounce, easy to overlook, turns out to be something closer to a sealed capsule, carrying inside it a compressed record of nearly everyone who ever walked into Britain and stayed. The map of human ancestry was never as tidy as the old stories suggested. It was never a single line moving cleanly from past to present. It was always this: fragments, folded together, preserved in unexpected places, waiting for the right instrument to finally read them. Some of those instruments, it turns out, have been sitting quietly in church registries and family trees the entire time, disguised as something as simple as a last name. If stories like this interest you, the kind where an ordinary detail turns out to be carrying an extraordinary history, subscribe, because there is far more hidden in the human past than most of us realize, and the next name we uncover might be one you already carry.